John Locke, the English philosopher, shifted the question in an important way. Writing after René Descartes, Locke engaged with many of Descartes' ideas, sometimes criticizing them, though not always accurately. We'll leave those philosophical debates aside and move closer to psychology. Locke asked a different question. Instead of asking what can be studied scientifically, he asked, how does consciousness develop? Where do our conscious ideas come from? In simpler terms, where do our thoughts originate? According to Locke, there are two kinds of conscious ideas, and therefore two sources from which they arise. The first source is the external world, everything we perceive through our senses, everything we experience from outside ourselves. These are ideas that originate from perception. Using Wilhelm Wundt's later terminology, we would call these the objective elements of consciousness, because they come from objects in the external world. But Locke proposed a second kind of idea as well. Its source, in his own words, is the internal activity of the mind. We've already touched on this idea earlier. It's the mind's ability to observe itself, to become aware of its own mental states, and to give an account of what is happening within. Locke called this unique capacity reflection. Reflection is the mind's ability to turn inward and examine itself. So we now have two kinds of conscious ideas. The first comes from our experiences of the external world. The second comes from reflection on our own mental activity. At this point, something extremely important appears. This distinction became essential for psychology, and later for Wilhelm Wundt. In a sense, we now have two domains of consciousness. On one side are our impressions of the outside world. On the other are the products of reflection. And this leads to a crucial conclusion. If reflection allows us to examine our own mental activity, then it also allows us to study those ideas that originally came from external experience. In other words, reflection itself can become a scientific method. It can become a way of gathering psychological data. Does every child possess this ability? Certainly not. Does every adult possess it? Not necessarily. Reflection has to be developed. It has to be practiced and refined. But once it is developed, scientific observation of consciousness becomes possible. Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am." Psychology now takes the next step. If reflection is possible, then consciousness itself becomes something that can be studied scientifically. Of course, this does not mean that every aspect of consciousness can be examined, only those aspects that are accessible through reflection. Here we need to be especially precise. This distinction became one of the foundations of early scientific psychology. Locke argued that reflection allows us to examine ideas that originate in external experience. Wundt expanded this idea. Using Locke's terminology for simplicity, even though Wundt himself used different language, we can say that reflection allows us to study not only ideas that come from the external world, but also our internal experiences. Not only the objective elements of consciousness, but also the subjective ones. Not only sensations, but feelings as well. Both become legitimate objects of psychological investigation. If a person possesses the capacity for reflection, then both objective and subjective experience can be examined scientifically. At this point, we arrive at Wundt's own terminology. He no longer speaks of reflection. Instead, he introduces the term introspection. Introspection literally means looking inward. But remember, what we observe inwardly includes not only our internal experiences, but also the mental traces of our encounters with the external world. This leads us to an important conclusion. Scientific psychology could emerge only because its participants possessed the ability to engage in introspection. it would be easy to assume that anyone could serve as a participant in psychological research. That was not the case. The earliest scientific psychology was, in many ways, a science practiced by a select group of individuals, people who had been trained to give accurate, introspective reports about their own conscious experience. And those reports were far more demanding than simply describing one's thoughts or feelings in everyday language. None of us, including myself, naturally possesses introspection in Wundt's sense of the word. It is a highly specialized skill. Its purpose is to isolate the elementary components of conscious experience. We'll discuss this method in much greater detail later. For now, it's enough to understand that the task involved identifying each individual sensation, describing every aspect of even the simplest conscious experience. Experiences so subtle that we usually never notice them at all. This also explains another important feature of early psychology. Psychologists had to train their own participants. They had to cultivate reflection and introspection before meaningful scientific observation could even begin. For that reason, the researchers themselves were often the participants in their own experiments. It was simply the most practical way to develop the necessary skills and apply them consistently. This was true not only for Wundt, but for many of his followers as well. Finally, there is one more important point. Early psychology placed complete trust in the participant's introspective report. Without that trust, the entire enterprise of what we now call classical psychology of consciousness would have been impossible.